In the Molly Leigh story, Parson Spencer's kind of the villain of the piece, often portrayed as overzealous in his convictions and having it in for Molly Leigh, who he accuses of witchcraft over a series of unfortunate events that he alleges were caused by her. He's also often portrayed as a drunk who neglects his duties in favour of spending time in the pub. Now, in recent times, Molly Leigh's character has been firmly redeemed as more and more details have been revealed about her life, mainly via her will. We now understand her in the context of being a fairly wealthy, independent and well-connected landowning woman, far from the malign crone that she's depicted as in the story. But what of old Parson Spencer? Is there a redemption story for him, lurking in the annals of history? That's what this video is about today. Who was Parson Spencer? And was he really the drunken, bitter wastrel he's often depicted as being in the story? Did he really have it in for Molly Leigh? Or is there more to it? We'll address the most common elements of Parson Spencer's character in the various versions of the Molly Leigh folktale. Firstly, that he had it in for Molly Leigh and was overzealously trying to persecute her as a witch. That he was neglectful of his duties as a minister and mismanaged the parish. And that he was a drunk who spent more time in the pub than tending to his duties. So firstly, let's look at what we actually know about the historical Parson Spencer. So sources on Parson Thomas Spencer's life are actually quite thin on the ground, or else they're buried deep in the archives of the local parish and diocese and are not readily available. There is one exception though. We do have ready access to a detailed transcript of the parish records of St John's Church in Burslem from the late 17th century to the 19th century, and this very handily covers the time period that Parson Spencer was minister of that church. I couldn't find any information about Thomas Spencer's early life, but the estimate of his date of birth would be roughly around the start of the 18th century. I also don't know if he was local to the area, or if he was brought into his post from elsewhere. The transcribed parish records are not 100% complete. Parts of it are illegible, or the names were sometimes omitted, which wasn't unusual in birth records from the time. There are other mentions of Spencer's in the birth, marriage and burial records of the parish, which suggests he possibly was of local stock, or at least had a connection to Burslem. We know from the register that he was minister of St John's from 1733 until his own death in 1771. Showing that he had a pretty lengthy spell in the post. In fact, it was the longest tenure by far amongst his recent predecessors and successors. He also appears to have been married to a lady named Eleanor, and had a daughter by her called Margaret, born in 1742, and he survived his wife by some years, with her passing away in April 1755. And to answer the question left in my previous video's comments, yes, Thomas Spencer was indeed buried in the churchyard of St John's in 1771, though his gravestone's likely to be long gone or completely illegible by now. His memorial inscription also doesn't appear amongst the diligently recorded entries on places.wishfulthinking.com, which leads me to believe that the grave is lost. So we do have some mundane info about Thomas Spencer's life, and a brief chronology of his career. So what of the three characteristics that I mentioned from the story? Is there anything in history about those? Firstly, did he have it in for Molly Leigh, and was he overzealously trying to persecute her? So are there any insights in the historical records that suggested he had any animosity towards Molly Leigh? Did he accuse her of witchcraft? And did he have any fallings out with her over his personal conduct, or over her financial affairs? In short, no, not really. There are no notes in the parish registers that really mention the Jackfield estate at all, apart from naming the widow Mrs. Leigh, who was Molly's mother, and her then-husband Joseph Booth as being responsible for appointing the church warden. In terms of her finances, it's rather interesting to note that a specially enforced tithe of 1741 did not include Mrs. Leigh amongst those named as requiring to pay. This either means that they'd already paid tithes regularly, or that the estate had already applied for a modus which exempted them. I can't prove this one way or the other without examining the documents in the Staffordshire Records Office, but I thought it was a curious detail. It would add some weight to the popular theory that the animosity may have stemmed from Parson Spencer's inability to enforce tithes upon the Leighs' estate. We also know from Molly Leigh's will that she doesn't mention any donation to the church at all. She mentions several charitable causes, including a fund for buying bread for the poor people of the parish, and for building of a hospital. While this doesn't directly imply any ill will towards the church or Parson Spencer, it is a somewhat curious omission. Modern interpretations of Molly Leigh's life often suggest that Parson Spencer may have been intimidated by her financial independence. That's entirely speculative, but there was perhaps some frustration around not being able to enforce any obligations on her. So what of the allegations of witchcraft? These appear to be pure embellishments to the popular folk story and have no basis in any credible historical source. The allegations that Parson Spencer makes vary from version to version of the story, and of course the Molly Leigh in the story is very different to the historical figure. In the story, she's generally depicted as a lonely, bad-tempered old crone who sells tainted milk at market, but we've already seen that this is far from the truth. We do know for certain that Molly Leigh was buried on the 1st of April 1748. The parish records clearly record this. However, there are no notes in the margins, no suggestions that this was anything other than a routine burial. We have the story of the exhumation and reburial, and we have the visual legacy of Molly Leigh's grave being in a different orientation to all the others to this day, but we don't have any written record of why this is. Given Parson Spencer's pretty meticulous record-keeping otherwise, this is quite interesting. Of course, even in the 18th century it was frowned upon to go around digging up bodies without any good reason, so it isn't completely surprising that he didn't record that he'd done it, and that it was his idea. It is possible that he just did it strictly off the record, to avoid any awkward questions from the bishop later on. I'm not sure how he explained the one grave that was perpendicular to all the others in the churchyard, though. That must have been quite difficult to hide, but I digress. It's also important to point out the obvious. If he really thought she was a witch, why would he bury her in the churchyard at all, let alone literally right next to the church itself? Burial rites in St John's churchyard were actually quite restricted to a set number of families at the time, the Leighs being one of them. And we also know for a fact that Parson Spencer did the burial himself. I can't imagine he would have done this on hallowed ground if he really thought he was burying a witch who had tried to make his life hell. There's also the small matter that you couldn't legally accuse a person of witchcraft in England at that time. This was the 18th century, not the 14th century. If anyone claimed to be a witch, they were then legally tried as a charlatan. So it's unlikely that Parson Spencer, who appears to be quite a fairly legally astute person, would actually do such a thing. So on balance, it seems unlikely that Parson Spencer actually accused Molly of being a witch in her lifetime. But what about after death? We do have quite a detailed account of Molly Leigh's funeral courtesy of her cousin Rafe, who was present at the burial. He details how some of the mourners apparently saw Molly's ghost in her home after the burial, and he says that when Parson Spencer was informed, he was absolutely certain that it was true. He doesn't say why exactly, but he believed the report straight away. Rafe also implies that laying the ghost to rest was actually Parson Spencer's idea, purely with the aim of putting people's minds at rest, because as you can imagine they were probably pretty spooked. The conversation then goes on to describe that Parson Spencer believed that the ghost would only remain at rest for 7 years, and he was apparently afraid that he wouldn't live long enough to see that time out. He also suggests that Parson Spencer was subsequently scared to visit the cowsheds in case he saw her ghost there. So he clearly had some misgivings about Molly, if this account's to be believed, but not necessarily anything to do with witchcraft. It seems the incident put the frighteners on more than one person on that day, and as Rafe Leigh's partner in conversation John Terrick attests, he never heard of any further reports of Molly haunting Parson Spencer after that. And as we've seen, Parson Spencer certainly lived much longer than the 7-year period following Molly's burial. So on this my conclusion is that no, he didn't really think she was a witch, and he probably didn't accuse her of witchcraft, but he and a few others may certainly have been spooked by the strange events after her funeral, so he was more scared of Molly Leigh the restless ghost than Molly Leigh the witch. So on to our next accusation. Was he actually incompetent, and did he mismanage the funds of the parish? In some versions of the story, Parson Spencer's grievances with Molly Leigh stem from her refusal to give money to the church, on the grounds that Parson Spencer was mismanaging the parish funds, either deliberately or through incompetence depending on the version. His long tenure in the post would perhaps suggest that he wasn't incompetent, although of course there are plenty of examples throughout history of people maintaining positions of responsibility despite being utterly hopeless at the job. But you would think that a small parish like St John's would suffer quite a lot if it was headed by an incompetent drunk for 38 years, and this doesn't appear to have been the case. Throughout that time, numerous charities existed in Burslem headed by the local wealthy families, all of whom were directly involved in the old parish system of poverty relief. If Molly Leigh had any misgivings about what was happening to these funds, they don't, at least on the surface, appear to have been shared by her peers. There is some anecdotal evidence that, on the subject of Molly Leigh's restless ghost, that he first informed Madame Catherine Egerton about the incident, and that she gave him the nod to carry out the exhumation and the process of laying the ghost to rest. Catherine Egerton was one of the more prominent figures in Burslem society at the time, being married into the powerful Wedgwood family. Yes, that one. And she was the occupier of the Overhouse estate, which was one of the largest in the town. This would imply that he had a fairly good relationship with the local landowners and the high members of society, and that she took his concerns seriously. There is plenty more evidence in the records of St John's to suggest that Thomas Spencer was actually quite a shrewd operator when it came to managing the parish, and quite a meticulous clerk at that. There are examples in the current transcript where Spencer himself had scrupulously copied records from previous record books, such as the list of members for electing church wardens, to make sure that these records were maintained. Another area he is particularly stringent on was the enforcement of tithes that were mentioned in the Terrier. This was a dossier that listed all of the lands of the parish and what their financial obligations were to the church. Parson Spencer writes in the parish register that in 1741 he requested payment of a special tithe to prevent estates that had not paid up from requesting exemption. This was in the form of a special privilege called a modus that could be applied for by an estate if they could prove that historically they had not paid any tithes for an extensive period of time. It seems the onus was on the church to request these tithes and not the landowners to pay them. This shows that Parson Spencer had a strong understanding of the legal landscape of the day and sought to ensure that his parishioners were properly paying their dues. The fact that he felt such a measure to be necessary suggests that things may have gotten a bit lax before his tenure, and he needed to put things right. There is a hint about this in the text. Although Thomas Spencer's ministry began in 1733, according to the list of ministers of the parish, it seems his predecessor left his post to take up another ministry in nearby Norton, and there's a note that explains that records from the period between 1733 and around 1738, when Spencer took full control, were not complete. This suggests during this time of transition some things may have fallen by the wayside. Did this enforcement of tithes cause any animosity? Well, we don't have any direct evidence to suggest that it did, but when you think about it, nobody likes being hit by a surprise tax bill, do they? Especially the rich. But we won't go there. The point is, I can't imagine they were thrilled about it, but without delving deep into the parish archives or the diocese, it's hard to prove that they had any open resistance to paying it, and that there were any legal proceedings around it. So I think it's safe to say from this that Thomas Spencer was actually a pretty capable minister who had a decent handle on the lay of the land, and liked to ensure that the church was getting what it was due from the parishioners. But yes, it quite possibly made him a bit unpopular. So the last thing to address is the popular image of Parson Spencer being a drunk. Well, this we certainly do have some anecdotal evidence of, courtesy once again of Ralph Lee and the account of Molly Leigh's funeral. After discussing Spencer's superstitions around Molly's ghost that we talked about previously, he goes on to say that Parson Spencer was fond of a drop of drink, and he would frequently get drunk and fall asleep outside of the alehouse until he got sober. He puts the appearance of Molly Leigh's ghost and the subsequent hysteria down to the funeral party being well away before they'd even left the house for the burying, and that they were drinking more afterwards. He doesn't directly say that Parson Spencer was drinking with the party, but he does say he was rather like he always was, implying that he was a bit drunk. Of course, in the 18th century, people were generally heavier drinkers than they are these days. It wasn't unusual to drink what would now be considered a copious amount of alcohol on a daily basis. I also rather imagine Burslem was probably pretty short on entertainment in the evenings, in the mid-18th century, so Parson Spencer probably wasn't alone in spending his evenings in the local alehouse. As for whether as a minister of the Church of England he should have been partaking in such behaviour is another thing. The Church didn't necessarily require vicars to be teetotal, but I'm sure it was frowned upon given his position of moral authority and responsibility. However, as previously discussed, it doesn't necessarily mean that he was neglectful of his duties because of it. The evidence we have for his drunkenness is purely anecdotal, but it certainly seems to be one characteristic from the Molly Leigh story that is consistent, and that does actually ring true with the historical figure. So I'm going to conclude that the evidence does tend towards this being true. So there we have it. It isn't a great surprise, really, to find that a character from a heavily embellished local folk story wasn't really the same person in real life. In reality, we find that Parson Spencer was a fairly shrewd cleric who looked after the interests of the church in his parish, even if he did it with a hangover quite a lot. Are you surprised by anything that you heard in this video? And do you have any of your own theories about Parson Spencer? Are there any other versions of the story that you've heard? Let me know down below in the comments, I'd love to hear them. Thank you very much for bearing with me through yet another Molly Leigh related video. I know there are quite a lot of them, but I hope you found it interesting. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe if you enjoyed it. I will see you again very, very soon.